Professor. The first question asks whether you can tell us more about the practice of Ubuntu that you referred to earlier.
Thank you, Alex. Ubuntu, in my language, we say, first of all, Ubuntu is a word that describes a communal connection among people. It's always seen as the opposite of the Cartesian notion of I think, therefore I am. In my language, we say umntu ngumntu ngabanye abantu. And literally that means a person becomes a human being because of others' presence. Another way of looking at it is that our subjectivity depends on being witnessed by others. That if there are people to witness us, to witness our story, that is the beginning of the construction of our subjectivity. But this is not a one-sided story. It's also about how we are then called upon to bestow humanity, a sense of humanity onto another. That by our actions, we bestow humanness on another person. And the significance of Ubuntu in this conversation about dealing with the past and about connecting with our former enemies is that when people who have wounded us as in a community, when they approach us with a sense of real regret, remorse, and turning the corner, that the idea of rejecting that change and transformation or that demonstration of change is something that is frowned upon. And if you are one that subscribes to the notion of Ubuntu, it is your responsibility to embrace the other person because you are responsible for their humanity. That's the idea of Ubuntu. It really lays a responsibility on your lap. I think that this is why in my work I draw a lot on Emmanuel Levinas's idea of responsibility for the other. It's an ethic that describes that orientation of how we are connected and how we therefore become responsible for others who are in a quest to restore their sense of humanity, that by denying them that moment, that opportunity to re-enter the realm of moral humanity, we are taking away from ourselves the definition of what it is to be human. In other words, it's not just about excluding the other person, but you diminishing in the eyes of others the perception of yourself as a human other.
In your work, you talk about the notion of reparative humanism. What is it that we are seeking to repair?
These crimes of humanity or crimes against humanity are crimes that are irreparable. You kill someone, you torture them, they live with the memory of the torture. It undoes them, it changes their identity. It's something that remains with them. They don't heal. We heal because we have to move from one day to the next. And so we live next to our pain. But it's something, the wound remains. And so I thought about this idea of the reparative as something that speaks directly to consciousness about how irreparable the brokenness is, and the challenge, therefore, of every day repairing, that it's an ongoing process, that the concept of the reparative suggests, that you repair and repair over and over again. If there's a crack, you can uncrack it, you can put it together, but the crack remains, it's visible, which means it's delicate, it's vulnerable. to falling off at that point again. And therefore, there's a sense in which that we are therefore called upon to repair every day. The reparative suggests this kind of movement, constant movement. And I thought about this word, this concept, after years of writing and thinking about forgiveness, and discovering that the word forgiveness means so much for many people, means so many different things for different people. And that sometimes and often, in fact, the word seems to suggest that something is finished. You move on, you're forgiven. Even that word forgiven, suggests a closure of something. You're forgiven, and therefore you move on. And in fact, people often talk about forgive and forget. People always say this, forgive and that. No matter how much you say, no, you don't forget. You forgive, but you don't forget. But it always comes back, this idea of forgive and forget. And the word itself seems to suggest the forgetting, and sometimes even people who have been forgiven, they think all I have to do is to apologize. And once I hear forgiveness, I say, oh, yes, I'm forgiven. Now I can move on. They don't realize, at least I found that with people who have forgiven, what they're really looking for is the promise that you will remember every day that this must not happen again. I was speaking earlier on with the Judge Moses from your country, who told me he worked in Arusha with the crimes in Rwanda. And he reiterates this point that when people forgive, they really want a sense of they want faith in their world that this thing will not happen again. That by forgiving, you're not closing the chapter, you're opening a new chapter. It's a new narrative. You're saying, now we are telling a new story, a different story about our past. And that story also means we must remember what happened in the past, and we must be vigilant. The idea is about vigilance. And so the notion of the reparative is really a call to that sense of vigilance, that this is something that can't be fixed quickly. And in fact, precisely because it's intergenerational, you're talking about a pain that keeps on repeating and keeps on returning in the lives of those who have been affected by this past. We haven't quite figured what exactly that transfer process is about, what happens when the trauma is transmitted and transferred. But we do understand, we've come to understand that the trauma is passed on. But what is critical in our societies, where victims, beneficiaries, perpetrators live in the same country, is that so often with people who have suffered from crimes of colonialism, slavery, oppression, genocide, and violence, and with people living in the same country, so often we find that the repetition that is visible is not in the sense of connecting exactly what happened in the past with exactly what is happening now. It's also subtle. It's subtle. It is something that you really sometimes are struck by how very thick the lines of connection between the past trauma and the lives of the present people are. And when you realize the connection, and more than the connection, think about contemporary issues that place people in that place of suffering still again, so that the repetition is not only about a recurrence of a past trauma, as Holocaust studies have shown us. In Holocaust studies, this is what we learn, that what is repeated are the traumas that seem to resemble the traumas or the impact or the effects of the trauma of survival of the Holocaust on descendants of survivors of the Holocaust. With our experiences, what we've seen, and whether you are in the US, in Australia, Canada, in South Africa, in all these countries, what we are witnessing is the repetition and the playing out of these traumas is kind of a redefinition of the trauma in the form, for instance, of constant imprisonment. We have to understand, why are people from certain groups ending up the majority, even in countries where they're in the minority? Why is it that they're ending up in the majority in these prisons? Now, we could say that, well, it's the fault of these communities. They're not taking care of their own. They're not bringing their children up enough. But when you look at these communities, there are communities that have inherited generations of poverty, generations of lack of absence, of exclusion, of humiliation. And it is that inheritance of that sense of humiliation often that defines the lives of descendants of these people. We underestimate the impact of the sense of humiliation on direct victims and their descendants. And if present and contemporary circumstances repeat the landscape of suffering of the ancestors before, then it reinscribes this sense of humiliation. And this is why the process of repair has to be ongoing, because you anticipate that this is going to return to haunt us again. And so the challenge of repairing is, how can we think about repairing in a way that really truly repairs, so that it's not simply about patching up, saving the child from violence, or, offering a part-time job as happens in my country, but it's about changing the future, of these people, so that it's possible to imagine a future. I speak in my work about, and in this paper I was going to speak about, it's not my original words, but the power of imagination, the power of imagining the possibility that we can actually care for each other. And that is the caring that I find that we do not think carefully about the importance of caring. We talk about empathy, but empathy is sort of a sense of understanding the circumstances of the other person. But caring takes it beyond empathy, and it's about, you are bones of my bone, you are bones of my bone, and therefore this cannot happen to you or to your child, and I'm here to make sure that it doesn't happen. And that's what I mean about reparative humanism. It's a kind of humanity that joins in solidarity with the other and takes responsibility for action to make things better. It's an early stage formulation, but that is in essence what it is about. Thank you.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a composition that was diverse in terms of faith, spirituality, ethnicity, and also the ability of members such as yourself to meet people where they were, literally, in your case, inside the home of a victim. As someone involved in the aftermath of the Christchurch attacks, how can our New Zealand monocultural ancient Anglo system adapt to the needs of the diversity of ethnic, emotional and spiritual needs of Christchurch, and how important is it for us to try to do so?
It is a very important question, and the touch on spirituality is very important, and it's a subject that even us in psychology we do not think about that often. And yet, when you think about brokenness, you cannot avoid thinking about the brokenness of spirit, so that when you think about rebuilding and restoring, that has to be also the focus of any intervention. Has to be on how do you rebuild a sense of, how do you reconnect people to their spiritual life, because therein lies the power of the deeply internal self, of our internal selves. What I want to say about, in response to this, is that the traumas of the past are, they play out as a kind of narratives in our lives. Trauma undoes us it creates a new story about who we are. And so we carry that story not only as an external, this is what happened, but as a very deeply internal, this is what it has made me. This is what I have become as a result of the trauma. And so in healing, the work has to think about the spiritual, because that's the essence of who we are, the essence, the quality of our humanness is also found in our spiritual lives. The way that, in fact, I think even about humanity itself as a kind of, as existing in the spiritual realm, not in the spiritual as in something that is beyond our heads, but something that we can't touch, we can't explain, but it's in the way that we are positioned in the world. And the way that we are positioned in the world depends so much on how we are witnessed in the world. If we are witnessed as inferior others, if we are humiliated others who don't matter, others who don't count in the world, that takes away that strength, of who we are. I see this in my country many times. Young people who brought up and wake up every morning facing this empty void, this sort of deep void of emptiness. And it's almost like what the question that confronts us is, who am I in the world? Do I matter? And if I don't matter, if I don't have a sense of feeling worthy in the world, how can I bestow worth on others without that feeling of worth myself? So these struggles about repairing the past ought to begin with thinking about what are the narratives that we carry within? What are the narratives of brokenness? And so it's not just fixing the outside, it's fixing those narratives that we carry within so that we can embrace a much more recognized human other. And by recognition, it's not just, I recognize you as human. It's looking at you and thinking, I wonder whose mother you are. I wonder, who is your child? And these questions are so important. And being on the commission, again, the commission as a teacher for us, there were moments when you really are just in awe with the notion of just what is possible in human beings. I tell you, I'm sorry, I tell our stories, I'll try and make it short. But there's one story, a woman whose son was killed in the army. He was part of apartheid's army. South Africa conscripted young white men to fight apartheid's war in what they called the border. It wasn't really the border. It was the countries that were fighting to become free, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and so on. And her son was killed in Namibia. And so when we had the Truth Commission, I invited her to come and tell the story. We read about it because we're trying to have stories at the Truth Commission that white people could identify with so they could also attend the commission. So anyway, her story, she told me her story and she asked me to tell it at the Truth Commission. Her name is Anne-Marie McGregor. She has allowed me to tell a story in ways she knows I respect it and I'll tell it respectfully. And so at the Truth Commission, Anne-Marie, the only white person in the room at tea time, there were black women whose children, whose sons had been killed violently by the apartheid regime. And her story was the last one I read just before tea time. And so when the tea break came and she was in this room, all the mothers from the Guguletu, the incident that was being heard that day was from a township called Guguletu. 7 young men had been killed violently by the apartheid government police. And all these women went up to Anne-Marie and they embraced her, without words. Each one of them in turn were embracing her. And later on, I would do research on this, just that one moment, and asking them, what is it that inspired you to reach out to her in this way? They'd never encountered a white woman. They've never felt this way to a white woman. And that inquiry led me to a deeper understanding of forgiveness, which was described by these women as something that comes from the depth of your stomach, from the womb. In fact, there's a word in my language that's called inimba. And so these women were telling me about how they felt inimba, this depth of feeling for this other woman. And some of them said, because we're mothers, we felt inimba for her son, and they were wounded, but they were able, as wounded others, to embrace this woman, even as a white woman whose son was part of a regime that was destroying black people. I mean, those are moments that teach us and show us that when we think about restoring communities, not in isolation of one another, but together, we have to go there. We've got to go to what is the brokenness of the heart? What is the narrative that we carry now? In this case, often in our countries, we find that there's a narrative of trauma that's easy and that's celebrated, as it were. But there's the narrative of guilt and shame that is so difficult to embrace. And so the idea of focusing on the Spirit bestows a certain level of awareness, a deeper level of consciousness, an awareness that recognizes that goes beyond simple physical recognition, but a recognition at a much deeper level that connects and says, yes, this is what it is to be human. You are bone of my bones. You are a fellow human being. And you can think about questions about, I wonder what this woman who lost her child, it's Christmas time. How are they going to sit around the table when their child, was killed by my child? It's those kinds of questions that really get to a deeper level of a different kind of consciousness that's future-oriented, that actually transcends the self, that goes beyond the self, not thinking about myself. This is self-transcendent position of thinking about the other person in a real way that is forward-looking, because you're not just thinking about the bombing now, you're thinking about what kind of community are you building? And again, just one last thing, I've seen this in Rwanda, this idea of people saying, what kind of community are we building now in order to answer Judge Moses' point, to respond to that point, in order for this thing not to happen again? This is why Rwanda is so complicated. Something is working, at the same time, it's very complex and very, sometimes for people who visit, very confusing. But what is very clear to me, having been to Rwanda many times now, is that what's happening in these communities is precisely this idea of building community, not just responding to an incident, but to building strong communities of solidarity.
Some people, notably the family of Steve Biko, criticised the lack of accountability of the perpetrators of killings during the apartheid era through the TRC process. Some have said you cannot have true reconciliation without justice. How would you respond?
It really depends what we mean by justice. There is the justice of the courts. You are prosecuted, there's an adversarial situation where you are facing your crime with lawyers on both sides. What became clear for me at the Truth Commission is that here was a moment that, rather than being adversarial, was invitational. And the value of the invitational is that knowing that the end point of this process is not about being sent to prison or being prosecuted or judged to be guilty. I am already admitting my guilt. And in order to go beyond the guilt, I am even prepared to feel for the other person. The environment and the process is so safe that it allows me, as the wrongdoer, to reclaim my sense of humanity. An adversarial process, in contrast, says, okay, I have a great lawyer, let's try to deny as much as possible, or let's say as little as possible so that whatever the sentence is as little as possible. And those are two contradictory positions. Now, if you think about what the justice of a process such as the Truth Commission is, we have to think about it from a very different perspective. For instance, what is the value of the openness of this person who is giving this information to this loved one, who otherwise, with a denial, would never have come to this place of now knowing what happened to the loved one? Now, this isn't to say that all perpetrators were truthful, but it is important to know that very often, now, one doesn't want to say all victims want is just acknowledgement. That's not true. But it's also true that victims want to hear the words from the perpetrator themselves that I did it. Because often victims carry the burden of blame, self-blame. You know, the women, Lindsay, when she was introducing me, mentioned the book that I wrote based on my interviews with Eugene de Kock. The first thing that struck me about this story is the importance of a true confession by a perpetrator. The women who were widows of men who were killed by Eugene de Kock, after meeting him, it opened up for them the floodgates of forgiveness. And it wasn't the forgiveness, I forgive you, therefore, go away. One of the women said, I forgive him and I want to hold him by the hand and to show him that it is possible to change. And so it's a forgiveness that cares. It cares enough for them to make sure that I want to hold them by the hand, make sure that they can have a chance to become human again. Is that, again, that sense of responsibility. Another woman says, Eugene de Kock's testimony and truth about what happened enabled us to retrace the steps of our husbands, to be with them in their graves and to resurrect them so that we can be present at the time of their killing. They said for them it was almost as if, in a symbolic way, they were back there at that point where they were being killed. They were present. They had been carrying the guilt of not having been there, judging themselves for not being there, whatever it is that they were doing. Now with this story, even if it is symbolic, as she was saying, as this woman said, it allowed us to retrace the steps. Now here is what is important about that. And then we can release them and then begin the journey of mourning. In all of these experiences of brokenness, the one critical issue, the one critical problem that makes it difficult for people to heal, to journey forward, is the difficulty to mourn. That on both sides, for perpetrators and for victims, the difficulty to mourn. And mourning means the first step of mourning is facing that truth. And what happens afterwards is also important, but the first step is facing that past and accepting it. Accepting it not in a way that says, well, it happened, just move on, but more, how do you live with it? How do you move forward? How do you understand these truth and reconciliation processes about understanding on all sides? When people say, I forgive, they have a journey within themselves. They are turning things around and saying, oh, this is who he was. Eugene de Kock was 16 years when he joined the military, joined the South African Army just after school, after high school. And then you have to think back, I have a child who is 16 or was 16 at the time. The child joins the army at 16 years. And then he is drawn deeper and deeper into this life of violence. Himself having had a life of violence in his life, in his family, and as a child at school who was bullied. And so there are all sorts of complexities. And so when people engage with these stories, it's an opportunity to really think about all of this. Think about what happened. Reflect on it. Make a decision about how to move forward. Put yourself in the shoes. One of the things that I had the privilege and really the blessing to do when I started with this work was asking myself the question, what would I have done had I been white? And there, by the grace of God, I was not born white. I don't have the burden of having to think about the guilt of having privilege and not opposing apartheid. There, by the grace of God, I am not white. And so it doesn't mean, of course, that we would have been like Eugene de Cox. But unless we are tested, unless we are put in those situations that we now judge others as having not done enough, not may have made the choice about, we really cannot, we do, but I really think we should not judge that harshly. We can judge, but not too harshly, because we don't know, if the tables were turned and the positions were switched. We don't know how we would have behaved. We know now in hindsight that if it happens again, I will be vigilant. I won't do this. Although sometimes, even when we know, we fall into the same traps. But it's really that consciousness about how do you make sure that these are teachers, these moments are teaching us on how to be human to one another.
It often sounded like women were victimized in particular and significant ways by apartheid. The loss of husbands, brothers, sons, and it sounds like these women were often the ones forgiving the killers. How adequately, would you say, did the TRC address the needs of women post-apartheid?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the women, it's people who came to the commission. In hindsight, there's so many things that we could have done differently. And the person asking the question is absolutely right. As a woman, you are a sexual object. You are a gendered object that is already positioned as an inferior other. And so many women were raped during, I'm talking about women who were detained, for instance. And women, because they are mothers, their losses is immense. You lose, and most of the activists happen to be men, although the activism happened across the board. But the targeting of activists tended to affect more men and sons and daughters, young people. So, yeah, there was the protection by counselors of survivors who came to give their testimonies, but it tended to be, in the moment, counseling and protection, and then people went home. And although in many cases people spoke about the importance of that moment of standing up in front of an audience, and remember that the commission was broadcast live every day on radio, on television. There was at the end of each week, there was a summarization of key points, and these stories being told over and over again. And so people had as witnesses to their stories a much broader than those in the hall. It extended far beyond. And that was very important for victims. But and as a result of that, they felt a sense of relief. And we heard many times when people stepped down the stage, they would say, I feel lighter. I feel as if a load has been lifted from my shoulders. But the reality, when going back to the people now, especially because of the work that we continue to be involved in, we find that that feeling has not been sustained because the loss is permanent. You do not have that breadwinner anymore. You do not have that child anymore. And so the loss is permanent. And so the commission did not follow up to find out what has happened to many of the victims who came to the commission. As a result, there is now a body, a victim support group that has emerged, people who are supporting all those people came to the TRC, and those who would have wanted to go but were not able to come to the commission. The question, of course, remains, what is the government doing as a way of picking up the pieces? Because the commission's life was 2 years, and it ended. Its mandate ended at the end of that mandate period. Our recommendations were diverse, complex, and all-encompassing, and so the responsibility was on the government to pursue the repairing work that was started by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that record is a dismal record.